The other African American that I'd like to highlight with you this morning is George Washington. Not the one you've heard of, but this wonderful man who has a very touching story as well. He was born in Frederick County, Virginia in 1817, so he's kind of the next generation now, 1817. He was the son of a slave and a poor white woman, but the father was sold in his slave status only a few weeks after the birth of young George Washington. As a result of that, the mother, who had no wherewithal to keep this child and care for him, asked a white couple, Anna and James Cochran, if they would take young George in as a foster child, which they agreed to do. And their friendship and family connection lasted for the rest of all of the Cochrans' lives. The Cochrans agreed to raise George as their foster child, and they did so. Well, they were not well-to-do themselves, and so in their quest to try to find better economic circumstances, they moved to Ohio, and from there they moved to the backwoods of northern Missouri. Young George, I think you would say the best word to describe him is a prodigy and a genius. Everything that he did, even as a child, was remarkable. His ability to pick up skills of a variety of different areas was almost a wonder to behold. He was an expert rifleman by the time he was 10 years old, and I mean expert. He was winning contests, involving people with much greater experience than he had. But he was also competent in other areas entirely. His foster mother, Anna, taught George to cook, to sew, and to knit, so that by his teenage years he was making all his own shirts, all his own pants, and all his own socks. So he was a pretty resourceful kid. He was not permitted to go to school because Missouri had laws against educating children of color in those days, and so he was not allowed to go to school. But Anna, his mother, would read the Bible to him, taught him dozens of hymns, and as it turns out, George was able to teach himself to read just by listening to his mother read and following her finger as it went along the lines of text in the book, and he could just pick it up and became quite a literate individual even at a fairly young age. He had, however, probably his most extraordinary giftedness in the area of mathematics. He was one of these people that I always wished I could be when I took mathematics. He could do these incredibly complicated computations in his head while other people were trying to get them done on paper. He just had one of those rather genius minds in that area, and that served him well throughout his entire career. He had so distinguished himself even as a young man that once again the legislature of Missouri made an exception for him, and he was given full citizenship rights by a special exemption of the Missouri legislature. That gave him the right to own land, and he started a couple of businesses. All of his businesses succeeded. He was quite a good businessman. He started a sawmill, miscellaneous other businesses, and yet he was constantly dealing with, though not legal discrimination, kind of that subcurrent of constant prejudice that was always making life unhappy and miserable, and it was frustrating to him. He didn't respond vindictively, but at the same time, as you can imagine, it was something less than what he could have hoped for. And so he also, as did his predecessor, thought, well, maybe the Pacific Northwest is the place to go. And so in 1850, 6 years after George Washington Bush had made this trip, George took the Cochrans, his foster parents, the family, and so on, and a few others with them on the Oregon Trail out to the Pacific Northwest. They settled in Oregon City, but discrimination laws that were in place then were still an impediment, and so he, as his predecessor, also crossed the Columbia River into an area that was still contested at that time and arrived there in 1852. He staked a squatter's claim, which was not uncommon in those days, at the confluence of the Skookumchuck and Chehalis rivers. It was a beautiful location, and so he staked out a place there to live. He put in significant improvements along the way. He established friendships with natives who called him Noklas, which was the native term for blackface, and that was his nickname among them. There were along the line, however, challenges to his claim. George maintained, as did our the other character we were looking at, a kind of open door policy. He was a Christian and he behaved like one. He was a man of hospitality, and he had this kind of free bed and breakfast philosophy to people passing by. And so he did this. However, on one occasion, there were two visitors who came, two men that were heading for further north, and they stopped off and spent the night there. And George, as he was saying goodbye to them and wishing them well, heard them talking to each other as they were leaving and saying to each other, two white men now, saying, "This is a beautiful spot. I think we should go stake a claim against this place. So thanks a lot," and George thought to himself, this could be trouble. And so, in a kind of quick set of moves, he was dealing with a situation where if they did stake a contrary claim, they'd have to pay the state for the property, and they had to pay George only for the improvements to the property. It would be a huge, huge, devastating loss, of course, if that were to be what happens. So George raced to the home of his foster parents. They didn't live that far away, to have them go down immediately to Olympia and buy the land in advance, do whatever you have to buy it, and they did that. So it prevented the sale to these two speculators who had come along. George, in fact, repurchased the property from them about 4 years later, and he was able to establish a land claim there for 640 acres. George continued to care for his foster parents in their old age. They died in around 1860. Well, George Washington continued to live in that area, and eventually laws passed that abrogated the anti-black ownership that had been the case. So he was able to buy more land, and he actually, because of his successes in business and otherwise, bought a fair amount of land in that area. He married in 1869 a woman by the name of Mary Jane Kunis. They were sitting at the kitchen table one day when they got word that the Northern Pacific Railroad was planning to build tracks through an easement right through the middle of his land. Some people might be upset to hear that, but George saw nothing but opportunity in this as he heard that the Northern Pacific was going to come through. He knew that his property was between two major rail stops. One was a town called Colima, and one was a town called Tacoma. And he thought, this would be a perfect spot for another little train stop along the way. And so he began to envision a town that would be midway between those two other towns. With his mathematical abilities and surveying skills, he went out and did a very respectable kind of plat map of a prospective town in that region. He staked it off, he lined up and measured out building lots for the town. His stepson, a kid named Stacy, who was, when he married a widow and she had a son, so he helped in this enterprise. And the two of them filed plans for a town called Centerville with the county auditor in January of 1875. This was an early photograph of that little town of Centerville. George wanted the Christian imprint to be indelible, and he thought about a heavenly city with pearly gates and streets of gold, and so he named the two intersecting major streets in this town the streets of Pearl and Gold, and that's the name of those streets to this day. The name was changed, of course, to Centralia, which I suppose some of you have already guessed. That was in 1886. George himself thought that was a better name for the town. The town grew rapidly. Newcomers came right and left. They bought up lots. George donated land, of course, out of his own means for a Baptist church, for a park, for a cemetery. For 30 years, George Washington was the leading citizen and benefactor of the city of Centralia. He had to deal with the same prejudicial attitudes. The irony is, here's a man of remarkable competence and skill and demonstrated ability to make things better, who still had folks moving into his town who didn't like him because he was black. And the grace with which he responded to that kind of arbitrary hostility, I think, remains one of the most remarkable aspects of his life. He kept working his farm. He was said to have, you could hear him singing a mile away. As he was plowing his fields, he'd be singing these wonderful hymns he'd learned from his mother so many years ago out there. You could actually hear him in town as he did so. As the town grew, George himself, who was a very astute businessman, among other things, became quite wealthy, but he maintained his Christian commitments. He was approached many times by people who wanted to put in saloons, gambling houses, other places of ill repute, and George was absolutely adamant. He did not want to have any part in any such operations, even though it would have been quite a windfall for him. He lent money often, many times in fact, with no insistence on repayment. It was kind of a standard phrase from him: if your family is in need, don't try to pay me until you get on your feet. I can wait for what you owe me. If you need food, I'll have some for you. You can work it off. It was that kind of attitude that he continued to maintain. There was one particular story that I thought was impressive. It was a man who was kind of a ne'er-do-well. He had a family, but he was viewed generally as kind of a lazy guy and sort of a jerk, you know. I don't know if you can envision such a guy. He was one of these prejudicial elements that really didn't have much to say that was good about George. But as it turns out, he lost his job at a certain point, and he was too proud, really, to let anybody know the desperate straits into which his family was descending. And so he was out there and just kind of trying to keep a stiff upper lip, and yet things were going from bad to worse. And as the story goes, as told by his stepson Stacy, this man came walking by George's house one day in town, and George just looked up at him sitting on the front porch and said, "Hey, you're just in time for breakfast." This was a man who had said nothing very civil about George in all of the time he'd been there. The man stopped, looked at George Washington, and George walked over to him and looked him in the eye and said this. He said, "Look at me and tell me how things are with your wife and children." And at that point, the man, so touched at this little mark of humanity, tears began to come down his face as he began to tell George Washington the desperate circumstances: no food in the house, kids, just in difficult straits, his wife, and so on. George Washington's wife overheard this conversation, and she came out and gave that man quite a scolding. She said to him, quote, "Why did you let things go so long when you knew you could always come to us? You take this to your wife and children." And she had a big bag of groceries that she stuffed into his hands. And then she said, "You come back and I'll have breakfast ready for you by the time you get here." And so the man did this, overwhelmed at this display of goodness in the face of one who had been anything but good toward George. The man did come back. George hired him. Stacy says in later reminiscence about this, quote, "My stepfather really made a man of him. He watched over him, encouraged him, and restored his self-respect in the eyes of his family and the neighborhood." And the man had a long-time employed relationship with George Washington that really did turn out to be quite a wonderful thing for both of them. He often overcame racial prejudice with kindness and patience. He really exemplified what Paul says: don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. This astonishing generosity was especially conspicuous during what was called Panic of 1893. And he, at that time, went way out of his way to do whatever he could to care for people who were in need. George Washington died at 87 years of age. It was 1905. On that day, the mayor of Centralia declared a day of mourning. All of the businesses in the whole town closed during the funeral of Centralia's famous founder. This is a photograph of him taken late in his life. The following quote is from History Link, which is a Washington State resource for historical personalities and so on, and it reads as follows. Mary Jane Washington died in 1888. George Washington remained an active civic leader in the town he and his wife had founded. He was noted for his willingness to help fellow residents in many ways, including selling property for little money down, offering loans at no interest, providing